Vietnam's jungle didn't just hide enemy fighters, it hid weapons that were never manufactured in a factory, that cost almost nothing to make, and that accounted for roughly 11% of all American deaths and 15% of all wounds sustained by American forces during the entire war. In the first months of 1965, Marine Corps records show that between 65 and 75% of all American casualties came from mines and booby traps. Not from firefights, not from ambushes, from devices that had been sitting in the ground waiting. If you're a veteran watching this, you already know what every step felt like. For everyone else, pay attention, because this is the side of the war that rarely makes it into movies. These videos take hours of research to get right, and it takes you 3 seconds to subscribe. It's free and you can always change your mind later. Right now, only 1% of the people watching this are subscribed to this channel. Be part of that 1%. Hit subscribe right now. Let's start with the one every veteran knows by name, the Punji Pit. The Punji Pit was a hole dug into the ground along a jungle trail, a rice paddy dike, a stream bank, or any terrain where American soldiers were likely to walk. The hole was lined with sharpened bamboo stakes pointing upward. A thin covering of leaves, branches, or loosely woven grass concealed the opening so completely that a soldier moving at normal patrol pace in low light had no realistic chance of detecting it. The stakes themselves were hardened in fire to make them rigid enough to pierce jungle boot leather and penetrate flesh. Military medical records show that Punji stake wounds had a 10% infection rate compared to 4% for other combat wounds. That gap was not accidental. The Viet Cong routinely smeared the tips of the stakes with human feces, animal venom, or plant-based poisons. The goal was not primarily the penetration wound. The goal was what happened afterward. A soldier's foot pierced by a feces-coated bamboo stake in a tropical environment would begin showing signs of serious infection within hours. The wound itself might be survivable in a clean medical environment. In a rice paddy outside of medical range, it pulled the soldier out of action, consumed a helicopter evacuation slot, occupied a bed at a forward surgical unit, and required the attention of medics and surgeons for days. Some variations of the pit angled the stakes downward along the sides, so that a soldier who fell in couldn't pull his leg back out without tearing the wound open further. He had to be extracted, which meant other soldiers had to stop, expose themselves, and work to pull him free. A unit occupied with extracting one man from a Punji pit is a unit that has lost its tactical initiative. The Viet Cong understood this precisely. Philip Caputo's A Rumor of War describes his unit's first encounters with Punji pits in terms that make clear how quickly the traps changed the psychology of movement. Every step in vegetation became a question that couldn't be answered until the foot landed. There was no way to know. There was only the habit of scanning the ground and the knowledge that scanning the ground wasn't reliable protection. Now let's talk about what soldiers feared more than the Punji pit, the Bouncing Betty. The Bouncing Betty was not a Viet Cong invention. It was a German design from the Second World War adapted by various military forces, and the version encountered in Vietnam was both the American M16 anti-personnel mine and captured or improvised variants. When pressure was applied to the trigger, specifically the weight of a human foot, the mine did not simply detonate in the ground. It fired a small propellant charge that launched the main mine body upward to approximately waist height before the primary charge detonated. Waist height. The design was deliberate. A mine that detonates at ground level primarily damages feet and lower legs. A mine that detonates at waist height targets the groin, abdomen, and lower torso. The injuries were catastrophic and frequently unsurvivable outside of immediate surgical intervention. Army medical records from the period document bilateral leg amputations, pelvic trauma, and abdominal wounds from Bouncing Betty detonations with a frequency that made the mine one of the most feared pieces of hardware in the theater. The specific terror of the Bouncing Betty was that there was a moment between stepping on the trigger and the primary detonation when the soldier heard the propellant charge fire and felt the mine rise from the ground at his feet. Veterans who survived detonations near them describe hearing the initial pop and knowing exactly what was coming. Some dove away. Some stood frozen. Some never had time to process what the sound meant before the main charge went off. During 1967 alone, mines and booby traps produced 4,300 American casualties. The following year, that figure rose to 5,800. The chief of the American Mine Warfare Center acknowledged in 1969 that even these figures were likely too conservative because many booby trap casualties were logged under other categories depending on how the reporting unit classified the mechanism of injury. Moving to something that cost almost nothing to build and caused an extraordinary amount of damage, the cartridge trap. A Marine Corps report on booby trap varieties documented the cartridge trap specifically because of how simple and how cheap it was. 4 components: a small bamboo tube, a nail, a piece of wood, and a single bullet of any caliber that American or South Vietnamese forces used. The bamboo tube was secured upright to the wooden base with the nail positioned so that when a bullet was placed in the tube, its primer rested against the nail's point. The entire assembly was buried along a foot trail with the bullet facing upward. When a soldier stepped on it, the pressure drove the primer down onto the nail and fired the round directly upward into the bottom of the foot. The wound was not primarily lethal. That was not the point. A bullet entering through the sole of the foot and exiting through the top removed a soldier from the field, required medical evacuation, and consumed the unit's time and attention. Multiply that by the number of cartridge traps deployed along a single trail system, and you have a tactic that degrades operational capability through attrition without a single combat engagement. The Viet Cong could deny a trail network to American forces without being present. Soldiers walking point learned to scan for the slight disturbance in trail soil that might indicate a buried device. The knowledge that this scanning existed is why the Viet Cong also disguised their devices using the impressions left by previous foot traffic, by placing traps in areas where American soldiers had passed safely multiple times before, and by rotating trap placements to prevent pattern recognition. Documented Viet Cong training materials captured during the war show that trap placement was a specific tactical discipline, not improvised. Cadre were trained in the psychology of how Americans moved and what objects they were most likely to disturb. The bamboo whip trap illustrates this point directly. The bamboo whip used the natural flexibility of green bamboo under tension. A length of bamboo between 3 and 10 feet, fitted with sharpened spikes along its striking surface, was bent back against its natural position and held in tension by a tripwire across a trail. When a soldier's boot caught the wire, the bamboo released with the full force of its stored tension and whipped across the trail at chest or leg height. The spikes were frequently coated with the same materials as punji stakes. The bamboo whip was documented specifically along narrow jungle trails where movement was channeled and soldiers had to walk in single file. The lead soldier might clear the tripwire by chance, passing over it without snagging it, and the second soldier might not. Or the point man might trigger it and take the full strike before the unit could react. Captured Viet Cong tactical documents showed that booby traps along trails were often placed in pairs or sequences. A soldier who survived the first device, or who saw a comrade trigger it and was pulling back to provide aid, was likely to trigger a second device positioned where the reaction to the first would naturally take him. This was the principle that made the booby trap campaign psychologically devastating in ways that extended beyond individual casualty events. It was not enough to know the traps existed. You had to know that the traps had been designed by people who understood how you would react to the traps, and who had placed additional traps in the locations your reactions would take you. Tim O'Brien's The Things They Carried addresses the psychological weight of this reality with the specific honesty of a man who walked those trails. The knowledge that the ground under your feet was not neutral, that it had been studied and prepared by people who were trying to kill you using the terrain itself, produced a form of exhaustion that was different from combat exhaustion. It was the exhaustion of sustained hypervigilance with no off switch. Every step required conscious attention. Every step in vegetation, every trail crossing, every fordable stream, every piece of equipment left by a previous unit was a potential trigger. There are no safe steps in Vietnam's jungle. That sentence appeared in more than one veteran's account of what the booby trap campaign felt like from inside it. One category of trap deserves specific attention because of how it targeted the basic human responses that soldiers could not eliminate even by knowing the trap existed. The Viet Cong documented practice of booby-trapping dead bodies, both enemy dead and American dead, turned the instinct to check for survivors into a lethal vulnerability. A soldier approaching a downed comrade to check for signs of life, or a unit moving toward apparent enemy casualties to assess the situation, was behaving exactly as the training and the human instinct both directed. The trap designers knew this. They positioned devices to detonate when that approach was made. Army after-action reports from multiple units in multiple years of the war document incidents of this specific trap type. The reports address it with military language that does not fully convey what the knowledge did to the soldiers who received it. Because the knowledge that you could not check on a fallen comrade without potentially triggering a device designed for that specific purpose did not produce tactical restraint. It produced trauma. It produced soldiers who had to override a fundamental human response every time they saw someone go down, and who carried the weight of that override for the rest of their lives. By 1968, the cumulative effect of the booby trap campaign had been documented extensively enough that Army leadership was describing it as one of the primary factors in combat stress cases among infantry units. The proportion of psychological casualties that trace directly or indirectly to booby trap exposure, the sustained hypervigilance, the inability to trust the ground, the override of human response to injured comrades, was significant enough to appear in medical reports alongside the physical casualty figures. The Viet Cong built these devices from materials available in any Vietnamese village: bamboo, nails, scrap wood, unexploded American ordnance that had failed to detonate and was recovered and repurposed. The supply chain was the countryside itself. There was no way to cut it. The men who walked those trails were not fighting an army they could find and engage. They were fighting a landscape that had been turned against them, one step at a time, by people who understood the terrain and the psychology of the men who were trying to move through it. Military records show that booby trap and mine casualties declined in later years of the war as counter-mine training improved and tactical doctrine adapted. The proportion of casualties never dropped to zero. No adaptation could make the jungle floor safe for soldiers who had to walk it. That is the documented record. If you served in Vietnam and encountered any of these traps, or have accounts that should be in the historical record, leave them in the comments. The official medical and after-action documents are preserved. The veteran memory of what it felt like to walk that ground deserves to be preserved alongside them. Subscribe and turn on the bell for more of what they didn't put in the textbooks. Sources are in the description.